What if the biggest fight in the history of combat sports is already being built in the background right now, quietly, methodically, with every piece moving into position while the rest of the world is distracted by the fights that are already announced? What if Dana White, a man who does not make decisions randomly, who does not book fights out of sentiment, who looks at every matchup through the lens of maximum commercial return, has already mapped out the sequence that leads to a fight that would generate more money, more attention, and more global reach than anything the sport has ever produced? What if Ilia Topuria versus Conor McGregor is not a fantasy, not a social media fever dream, not the kind of fight that sounds great in theory but never materializes? What if it is actually 2 fights away from being real? That is the argument we are going to make today, and we are going to make it seriously, with the evidence that supports it, and with a clear-eyed assessment of what has to happen for it to come together. But first, we need to establish why this fight is different from every other dream matchup that fans build up and promoters quietly bury. Because most super fights die in the negotiation room. Most legacy matchups never survive contact with contractual reality, with ego, with the competing priorities of 2 fighters who are each the center of their own universe. This one is different for specific reasons. And understanding those reasons is the only way to understand why the pieces are moving the way they are. Let's start with Ilia Topuria, because his trajectory is the spine of this entire story. Topuria is 17 fights into his professional career, and he has not lost once. He has not been in a genuinely close fight. He has not been in a situation where you walked away thinking the other guy nearly had him. He walked through Josh Emmett, a man with legitimate power and experience. He dismantled Alexander Volkanovski, who at that point had only lost to Islam Makhachev and was considered the best pound-for-pound fighter on the planet by a significant number of analysts. He beat Max Holloway, the man who many argue is the greatest featherweight of all time, in a fight that wasn't as competitive as some of the pre-fight conversations suggested. He knocked out Charles Oliveira, a submission artist, a former champion, a man with extraordinary finishing ability at lightweight, in a manner that was almost shockingly decisive. And now he is heading to the White House to defend his unified lightweight title against Justin Gaethje, a fight that Topuria's camp appears to view as the final step before the truly historic conversations begin. The reason Topuria's record matters in the context of the McGregor fight is not just about credentials. It is about narrative architecture. Ilia Topuria has been systematically defeating the legends and icons of the eras immediately before his. Holloway, the face of featherweight dominance for years. Volkanovski, the man who succeeded Holloway and pushed the division to a new level. Oliveira, the most prolific finisher the lightweight division has ever seen. These are not random opponents. These are specific symbols of what the generation before Topuria built. And Conor McGregor is the ultimate symbol of that era. He is not just a former champion. He is the man who changed what the UFC was commercially, who took the sport from a niche product to a mainstream global phenomenon, who made the Octagon a stage in the truest theatrical sense. Defeating Conor McGregor would not just be a win on Topuria's record. It would be a statement about the transfer of power from one era to the next. And Topuria understands that. He has said as much, in his own way, in interviews where his confidence shades into something that sounds almost like hunger. Now let's talk about what Topuria actually needs to accomplish first, because the McGregor fight doesn't happen unless the White House card delivers the right result. Gaethje is not a soft touch. He is a former interim champion, one of the most durable fighters in the division, a man with elite low-kick ability and genuine knockout power in both hands. But the stylistic matchup between Gaethje and Topuria is one that analysts have been increasingly concerned about in Gaethje's direction. Gaethje has publicly stated his intention to walk forward and apply pressure throughout the fight. He has said he will put himself in dangerous positions to create the exchanges he needs. And the problem with that approach, stated plainly, is that it is the same approach Charles Oliveira took, and Oliveira found out within the first round what walking forward into Topuria's precision actually produces. Topuria's front-weighted boxing stance gives him extraordinary power at close range, but it also creates a specific mechanical vulnerability to leg kicks that Gaethje is elite at executing. If the fight becomes intelligent, if Gaethje uses his low kicks to disrupt Topuria's base and operates with patience rather than aggression, it becomes more complicated. If Gaethje walks forward and trusts his chin, it ends the way Oliveira ended. Either way, the dominant expectation is a Topuria victory, and the expectation from the perspective of the McGregor timeline is that the victory is not just a win but a statement. Because here is what Dana White needs from this fight. He needs Topuria to look undeniable. He needs the White House card to produce an image. Literally an image, one that goes across every sports network and news outlet on the planet, of Topuria holding his belt in that setting with a performance that makes even casual observers understand they are looking at something special. That image is the commercial foundation for what comes next. Because the next conversation, the one about McGregor, requires a public that is already paying attention to Topuria. And that public will be paying attention if the White House performance is what everyone expects it to be. Now let's turn to the other side of the equation, and here is where it gets genuinely complicated. Conor McGregor is fighting Max Holloway at International Fight Week in Las Vegas. This is the fight that determines whether McGregor is still a viable opponent for anyone at the elite level, or whether the years away from competition, the injury, the lifestyle, and the weight of his own legend have finally caught up with him in a way that the cage will make undeniable. Max Holloway is a brutal measuring stick for this assessment because Holloway has been one of the most active and consistently elite fighters on the roster for years. He is coming off a knockout of Justin Gaethje at UFC 300 that is still being discussed as one of the greatest individual moments in the sport's recent history. If McGregor beats Holloway, and it is a genuine if, not a foregone conclusion in either direction, then the conversation about his comeback is completely transformed. He is no longer the returning legend managing his legacy. He is an active fighter who just defeated a man ranked among the best in the world. His value as an opponent for Topuria becomes not just commercial but athletic. Let's be specific about what a McGregor victory over Holloway would actually mean for the Topuria fight's probability. McGregor has 2 fights remaining on his current UFC contract. The promotional structure around him, the negotiating leverage, the financial arrangements, the media obligations, all of it shifts dramatically based on whether he wins or loses at UFC 329. A McGregor win gives him maximum leverage in any subsequent conversation. He would be in a position to demand the biggest possible fight, the biggest possible payday, and the biggest possible stage. And the biggest possible fight, the biggest possible payday, and the biggest possible stage is Ilia Topuria. Not just at featherweight, not just at lightweight, but potentially at welterweight where both men would theoretically be competing without a size disadvantage on either side. That is a fight that the commercial forces of professional sports would be almost impossible to resist. Promoters, broadcasters, sponsors, streaming platforms, everyone who writes checks in this industry would be pulling in the same direction to make that fight happen. And consider what Dana White sees when he looks at that matchup on paper. He sees the most famous name in the history of his company against the most dominant active champion on his roster. He sees the showman against the assassin. He sees the man who built the institution against the man who is currently defining it. He sees a press conference that would generate more online traffic than almost any sporting event announcement in history, because McGregor at a press conference table across from a fighter he wants to destroy is its own form of entertainment. The trash talk, the psychological warfare, the competing egos, McGregor's magnetic, calculating arrogance colliding with Topuria's cold, precise confidence. Both of them have the gift. Both of them understand that the fight is sold before the first punch is thrown. That press conference alone would be worth more in earned media than most full fight cards generate in paid viewership. The commercial projection for this fight is genuinely staggering when you start to work through the numbers seriously. A McGregor fight has always moved the needle in ways that other fights simply do not. His name on a card changes the ticket price conversation, changes the pay-per-view buy rate, changes the broadcast deal terms. When you add Topuria, a man who has his own passionate following in Europe and Latin America, who carries genuine mainstream appeal across multiple markets simultaneously, you are stacking 2 distinct commercial ecosystems on top of each other. The American market responds to McGregor. The European market, particularly Spain and the Georgian diaspora, responds to Topuria with intensity that rivals anything the sport has seen. The Latin American market, which has been growing faster than almost any other region for the UFC, responds to Topuria with genuine fervor. A single fight card that activates all 3 of those markets simultaneously would produce numbers that dwarf every previous record the sport holds. Pay-per-view buys, gate revenue, sponsorship activation, social media engagement, every metric would be testing a new ceiling. There is also a legacy dimension here that goes beyond the commercial analysis, and it deserves serious attention because it is actually what drives Topuria's motivation more than the money. Ilia Topuria has spoken about wanting to be recognized as the greatest fighter of his era. He has spoken about wanting to defeat the symbols of the eras that came before him, to literally consume the legacy of every fighter who defined the sport before he arrived. Holloway is done. Volkanovski is done. Oliveira is done. The next man on that list, the man whose legacy is larger than all of them combined in terms of cultural impact, is Conor McGregor. And Topuria understands that defeating McGregor in a dominant fashion, specifically in a dominant fashion, not just winning a decision or surviving a tough fight, would be a statement that no future conversation about MMA's all-time hierarchy could ignore. McGregor's cultural imprint on the sport is so large that defeating him carries symbolic weight that is almost independent of where McGregor actually ranks as an active competitor. It is a statement about ownership of an era. For McGregor, the calculation is different but equally compelling. At 37 years old, with 2 fights left on his contract, he is in a negotiating window that requires maximum commercial activity in a compressed time frame. A win over Holloway restores his market value. A subsequent fight against the most dominant active champion in the sport, at a weight class where McGregor's size and reach create genuine tactical problems for Topuria's short-range boxing system, would be the kind of event that justifies everything. The payday would be extraordinary. The stage would be the largest available. And McGregor's counter-punching system, built on distance management, long jabs, and the timing to catch a charging opponent with the left hand, is actually not a terrible match for certain scenarios against Topuria. It is not a favorable matchup for McGregor. But it is not impossible either. And McGregor has always been more dangerous when the odds against him are real rather than manufactured. The technical breakdown of how this fight would actually unfold is where the conversation becomes genuinely fascinating. Topuria's power is concentrated in the short distance. He loads onto the front foot, generates torque from a compact stance, and delivers shots that have dropped bigger and more experienced opponents than McGregor at this stage of his career. The risk for Topuria is the same risk that exists in every fight where his opponent has significant counterpunching ability, getting caught while loading up, or misjudging the distance against someone with McGregor's timing. McGregor's jab and his front kick are both designed to disrupt forward momentum and create the half-second of hesitation that his left cross needs to find its mark. If McGregor is genuinely at his best, if the camp has been as rigorous as he claims, if the shoulder is fully healed, if the competitive edge has survived the years of inactivity, those weapons are still dangerous. The question is whether they are dangerous enough against someone moving as well and hitting as hard as the current version of Topuria. The answer, honestly, probably favors Topuria. But it is not a foregone conclusion in the way that some of Topuria's recent matchups have appeared to be. The sequence of events that needs to happen is clear. Topuria wins at the White House, ideally in convincing fashion, ideally in a way that generates the kind of performance footage that becomes permanent content in the sport's highlight archive. McGregor beats Holloway in Las Vegas, ideally in a manner that demonstrates he is still a legitimate elite-level competitor rather than a name selling tickets on nostalgia alone. And then Dana White, who has been watching all of this with the patience of a man who knows exactly where the market is heading, makes the phone calls that need to be made. Not with fanfare, not with a dramatic press conference announcement. With the quiet precision of a man who has moved billions of dollars through the sport and who knows exactly what the next billion looks like. There is one final dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed, but that shapes everything about how it unfolds. The transfer of power in combat sports is not just athletic. It is cultural. It is commercial. It is about who owns the conversation in a given era of the sport. Conor McGregor owned that conversation for years, not because he was always the best fighter in the world, but because no one in the history of the sport has been better at making the entire world care about what he does inside and outside the cage. Ilia Topuria is in the process of claiming that space. The performances are there. The personality is there. The commercial momentum is building. But a performance against McGregor, against the man who defined the commercial template that everyone in the sport is still working from, would complete that transfer in a way that nothing else can. It would not just be a win. It would be a coronation. And everyone who understands this sport at the deepest level knows it. The table is set. The pieces are in position. 2 fights stand between where we are now and one of the most significant events in the history of professional sports. Topuria at the White House. McGregor against Holloway in Las Vegas. If both men do what they are expected to do, and there are genuine reasons to believe they will, then what comes next is not a question of whether. It is only a question of when, and where, and how loud the world gets when Dana White finally makes the announcement.